Welcome viewers to the series Exploring Careers in Data Analytics. My name is Ulysses Comps. I'm class of 2024.5 at Middlebury College, and I would like to introduce this episode's guest speaker. I'm joined today by Michelle Roman, class of 17, Senior Manager of Analytics at Aspire. Welcome and thank you for joining us, Michelle.
Thanks for having me.
So Michelle, this series explores a number of different professional roles involving data analytics. So tell us a little bit about the work that you do at Aspire.
Yeah, so I think I'll talk a little bit about my journey and how I ended up at Aspire, just for context.
Yeah, sure.
So as you mentioned, I'm the Senior Manager of Analytics at Aspire on their research and evaluation team. And I actually originally went to Middlebury to study foreign languages, and I loved the critical thinking aspects of sociology. And through those courses, I grew more aware and had more words for structural inequities that I could see and personally experienced as a first generation low-income student of color. And it's actually what drew me to social impact work. So my first internship during my last J term was with a local nonprofit organization called Women's Safe, which supports survivors of domestic and sexual assault. And I was just really inspired by the incredible work they do for their community. And it helped me to see nonprofit work as an opportunity to support social change. And on the data side, I hadn't taken anything related to data before Middlebury. And it wasn't until my last semester that I started thinking about data analysis as a potential field for me. It all started in my social statistics or social stats class. We had just gotten a new quantitative sociology professor, Matthew Lawrence. And in his course, I learned to code and answer social questions using quantitative data. And it just felt really tangible and practical, especially being a humanities major with how abstract a lot of the topics can be. But I was still able to think about really important social questions. And I found coding kind of similar to language learning in the sense that you're trying to communicate an idea using different grammar and different symbols. And there are vestiges of some other languages and quirks that you just kind of have to memorize and live with, which is true of all languages. And so, yeah, after graduation, I was looking for a way to continue learning about code. And ideally, that would be somewhere in the social impact space. And I ended up finding the data coordinator role originally on Handshake through a friend. And it allowed me to really hone in on my coding skills to program more professionally and clean that messy real world data that everyone talks about, as well as build some visualizations for folks. Because it's a really small team, I started to wear many hats. And as I progressed, I was able to start managing and training people on that data processing that I was doing originally and spend more and more of my time on the evaluation and analysis piece. And so now I supervise the data engineering process, and I'm leading some independent analysis work on strategic questions about our advising programs.
Cool. Wow. So amazing. A lot to unpack there, but why don't you take me through the kind of data analytics workflow that you may encounter, for instance, in a day at work? Like what specific methods and tools are you using to analyze and yeah.
So I'm part of the research and evaluation team and design team. So I can break that down into different pieces. So research is future looking. There's best practices in the field that we should be aware of and some best areas for us to collaborate with other researchers and studies that we should be thinking about internally. Evaluation is past looking and where I spend most of my time. So that's where we ask the question, what can we learn from the past several years of data that we have gathered from our models? And the design portion is really the here and now. So how can we take the best practices in the field and what we know about our implementation strategies to iterate on the models that exist today? So what recommendations can we make from our team of those models? So we really think of ourselves as storytellers. Data can be really confusing and intimidating, and not everyone has the time to look at it. So we try to really elevate trends that are most important to our stakeholders for them to make informed decisions. As I mentioned earlier, I focus mostly on the evaluation side of things, as well as the data engineering or data processing piece. I can use an example for advising model because that's where we have the most data. We receive student data from partners and students themselves and advisors through rosters and surveys and data entry, respectively. And so through those different sources, we get demographic information, financial aid specific data points, and the impressions of students' experience while they're working with us. And so there's lots of variations in those sources from year to year and from partner to partner. And so if we take roster data as an example, we'll get an Excel file and we'll run it through our data engineering pipelines. And so those pipelines are a collection of scripts that we actually write in R, a programming language that was developed by statisticians, really common in data science. And those scripts standardize the data in each column for us so that we can map the correct columns and rows to the formatting requirements of each field in the database that our internal staff use. And after that data is in the system, we can personalize our services in person and begin texting students. And it also helps us figure out which students might need more support off the bat. And it helps us begin substantive conversations around financial aid the first time that we meet them, rather than beginning with, hey, what's your name? What's your date of birth? Like those types of questions. And we then use the data in those databases to start to investigate those priority questions. We do this a variety of ways, but primarily we use R and Excel to do our exploratory analysis on the team. But we have done more experimental things in the past, and I can go into detail on any of that if need be.
Wow, that's great. That's really cool. What do you find most challenging and most interesting about your work?
Yeah, so what I find most interesting and challenging is how in the heck we find ways to evaluate an ever-changing program. U Aspire, like most nonprofits, is a very community or student-centered organization, which means that we try to iterate on our program to meet students where they're at, which is a wonderful endeavor implementation-wise. And it also makes trying to track progress and success and the metrics that are best suited for that work kind of difficult. So we really have to find creative ways of evaluating how students are doing over time and how our interventions may have impacted their outcomes in the long run.
Cool. Wow. How do you feel like I know at Mid it sounds like you didn't really encounter data science until your senior year, but how do you feel like your liberal arts education and specifically your major in sociology and anthropology has kind of framed the way that you look at data analytics maybe in a different way that for instance, I'm a computer science major and I may look at problems completely differently than someone who maybe started with the kind of the issues that we wanted to solve and then learned how to solve them or how to analyze the data that comes from those issues.
Yeah, it's a really good question. As I mentioned towards the beginning, sociology really gave me a lot of the words to talk about inequities in the broader world. But I feel like a liberal arts degree in general, and I guess maybe this is specific to sociology, but it made me more accepting of counterintuitive findings. A lot of what I did in those abstract courses is just questioning what we think we know and just going into different research and different questions with kind of an open mind. And a lot of the draw of those liberal arts classrooms is smaller classes with lots of writing and discussion. And at least in the humanities, we get a ton of practice synthesizing complex ideas through different mediums. And that's really, really key in the technical space, is to be able to communicate your findings to non-technical colleagues who need that information in order to make decisions and to do their work.
And I suppose maybe part of the way you do this through data visualizations. Maybe would you talk about what's specific, for instance, for an example, what specific data visualizations would you make to take complex data and put it in a form where people can understand?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So an example of something I did when I first joined U Aspire was building a dashboard using the database tools that we already have. So instead of building something outside of it and a tool like Data Wrapper or Tableau or something that's completely out of the ecosystem that people are familiar with, I took the same information that we had previously stuffed in like a PDF and transitioned it into a dashboard that was in the database where people were already familiar with the tools and just simplified it to have the correct cuts of data that they're most interested in. So if we were looking at what are our yearly outcome numbers for students across different classes, and then we would just be able to filter between those different sites. using some simple filters. So just building the best tool for your audience versus like building the coolest or most interesting tool that you could think of that probably isn't going to meet their needs exactly.
Cool, thank you. Um, what do you feel like are the biggest challenges that are shaping your role today and going into the future?
In terms of the future of the college access space in general, I can sort of start there. So there's great research out in the college access space around some wraparound services that support students academically, socially, emotionally, as well as with financial aid, like the CUNY ASAP program that's being piloted in several states. And U Aspire is currently in the midst of their strategic planning, but financial aid policy, for example, is having a huge moment right now with many states moving to make FAFSA mandatory for high school seniors and increased transparency with aid offers and increased Pell Grant amounts in the horizon. There's definitely a long way to go there, but we're poised to provide a lot of expertise there. And for myself, I'm thinking about the aspects of data science that I'd like to specialize in, whether that's more the business analytics side or data engineering or more program evaluation. Like I could see myself moving to the private sector to learn more about the cutting edge technologies that are available in the space and work on a larger team. But I could also see myself in the course and learning more about how to do rigorous program evaluations through experimental designs.
How are you personally thinking about studying data science in the future in a kind of more formal setting?
Yeah, I personally feel like what I've heard from, I have friends who are also in the data science space and have gone on to do their masters. And what I've heard, and this is just my perspective and what I've heard, is that data science is really new as a field, but it's especially new as a major or minor. And even though it does communicate something, the learning and the courses that are taught are not standardized. So when you say to someone, I have a degree in data science, they don't really know what that means. And so what I've seen a lot of people do is because they don't have a degree that necessarily like conveys something like standard, like something like I have a degree in statistics or I have a degree in mathematics. They then lean on sort of the credibility of their university to say, oh, I'm going to this prestigious university that can lend some credibility, where there's like a gap in like understanding exactly what that means. And there are a lot of boot camps out there that I know that folks have done to further their education. I think in my experience, I haven't found something specific in a major, like unless I went into program evaluation, I don't know that I would necessarily consider going directly back to school, just because I don't know that doing rigorous statistical things is really where I want to go. I think there's aspects of data engineering that really interest me and like design that interest me more. And I think I can learn more of those things on the job than I would in an academic setting. And yeah, I can definitely tie it back to more of the classes and courses that people are taking at Middlebury if that's of interest.
Yeah, please do actually.
Sure, yeah. So in terms of how classes can help, when you're looking for things in the nonprofit sector in particular, I would say that interest in the mission, whether that's through volunteering or internships or something that's adjacently related, is a really helpful signal that you care about the mission, especially if you have a more technical background or have something that's unrelated and you're trying to pivot into that nonprofit's role. That's really what we care about most at U Aspire, is the passion and connection that people have to the mission. And I can really only speak from my experience. I actually manage an intern from a local college, and I'm always thinking about how to evaluate fit for entry-level analytics roles for college students. And I've seen people who are really technically skilled who do really well, and with only basic technical experience who also do really well. So what I look for is thoroughness, curiosity, and communication. So as far as majors go, I really worry more about skills and how you've used them in your projects. So on the quantitative side, because there are different types of analytics. So on the quantitative side, any coding or data projects that you can talk about, whether that's in R, Python, and SQL or SQL, which I know are pretty widely used in the field, But I know in certain geography classes, for example, you do some coding, you do something that's related to it. So anything that you can talk about related to that and working with large quantities of numbers would be helpful there. On the qualitative side, any surveys that you've helped administer, interview transcripts you've analyzed would also be great examples to have. Like essentially what I'm looking for is someone who can articulate an end-to-end data project using sources, knowing their methodology, knowing why they pursued that question in the first place, why they left certain things out, and what exactly your results were. People want to see how you approach and investigate questions. So I really wouldn't get too hung up on, at least for folks who don't have a super technical background, on those technical skills. Like having an awareness and having some basic experience is helpful, but I found that I can and have taught people technical skills that they would need on the job. And what I haven't found out how to coach is really the curiosity and persistence it takes to pursue a question when the analysis drags on forever, or we need to iterate to find the questions that we're able to answer with the available data. Like that takes a lot of soft skills that I think are harder to coach. So as best you can, I would try to just really communicate that when you're looking for different roles in the data space and nonprofits.
Well, thank you for that advice. I know you talked briefly about maybe some curiosity in exploring data science in the private sector, and I'm curious, how did you know that you wanted to work for a nonprofit when you were in college, or was it something you decided on later? And how do you feel like what are the benefits of working for data science in a nonprofit like you Aspire versus maybe working in data science for a profit maximizing firm in the private sector?
Yeah, it's a really big question.
Yeah.
I talked about this a little bit in I think it's a good question. So when I was talking briefly about sort of my path to Aspire, I touched on that I didn't know until much later that I wanted to do nonprofit work until I had done a J term and sort of experienced what that work was like. And as far as how it compares to for-profit work, I can't, what I've heard from folks, and this is just my 2 cents, is that, I can say that historically in nonprofits, research work has been pretty underfunded. There is like a surge in looking for things now as data becomes more ubiquitous and people are all trying to be data driven. So there's more and more nonprofits investing in full-time research and evaluation teams, though they still tend to be smaller and you tend to wear many hats, and there's benefits and drawbacks to that. The benefit is I know our data lifecycle end to end and sort of I'm tinkering around with all of it. Whereas in a for-profit, if there's a lot of folks working on the entire data lifecycle, or if you're on a team with a ton of different analysts, maybe you're working on a really specific set of questions and that's really what you hone in on, or folks who work on just a couple of different data points and are trying to increase profits for their company. So yeah, that's I think what comes to mind off the top of my head. I can share more about that if you'd like.
No, that's great. Thank you. So Michelle, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. But given your experience in the field of data science, how would you, what advice would you give to current students who are interested in the field on how to best prepare themselves, just in general, for an entry point into the field of data science?
Yeah, so great question. As I mentioned, the teams do tend to be smaller at nonprofits, but it is a huge need because funders are looking for different ways of quantifying the impact that folks have on their given communities. And something that I can share as far as setting expectations when you are entering the field is there is an old joke in data science that you spend 80% of the time cleaning and 20% of the time doing analysis. And I personally have found that to be true on the organizational level, but also for each question you're exploring, right? If you're exploring a question with different variables that you haven't considered before, you have to deeply understand them and think about exactly how you're going to use them in your analysis. And there is always going to be some cleaning involved. I would also share that there's kind of a hierarchy of data needs to keep in mind. And so an organization initially would need to define their metrics, and then gather consistent, relevant, and accurate data and make it accessible for people before any of the data in that system can be trusted enough to draw conclusions from it. So I wouldn't go in, especially in the nonprofit space, expecting to do like machine learning or predictive analytics right away. That work needs a lot of accurate available data, and there's a lot of alternatives for you to meet your audience where they're at and help get them closer to the answers to their questions with much simpler methods. Like speed is really huge in analytics, and exploratory work may be all that you need to learn more about the questions. So going into a role and expecting to do like really complicated things might be kind of like going in and assuming that the only tool you have in your toolbox is a chainsaw when really all you need is a pair of pliers or something. So just knowing your toolkit really well and being able to not get so excited when you see your first question and be like, oh, this definitely will need like the machine learning thing that I learned at the very tail end of my last class, and maybe you just need something like a table.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I've learned that analytics, when it's done really well, that I've seen, it actually influences decision making, and to do that you need some knowledge of the industry and what your company cares about, and that comes with time. Like an interesting finding is not always the same as an important one, and it's kind of hard to tell that until you're in the industry for a little bit or you know your company pretty well. Internships with your audience is pretty critical. If you're going to be sharing things with people, they have to care about and trust what you're going to share with them. Otherwise, you're just sort of talking at a wall in a corner, and like that's not useful for anyone, you know?
Yeah.
I know that folks mentioned that it's not just current students, but it's also recent alums who are looking at these sorts of videos. So, and I can share that I personally had a longer job search than most to find something in my field. I just know how discouraging that can be. So I wanted to share something if it takes a little while, if you're coming into the field, not having the exact experience that you want, just to really leverage that alumni network. So if you're interested in a company or a role, really look at those second connections and reach out to them to get an informational interview or learn about the org culture and the team. I found that it was the most reliable way to get first round interviews. I'd also really reflect on fit and what you're most curious about. So knowing what environment you thrive in, what tasks really motivate you, what rhythm of work works best for you. And I've learned this from managing people and also just trial and error by myself, but it really depends on the person. For some people, being really collaborative and flexible is important to them. For other people, it's independent and structured. Maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe you're motivated more by hitting like profit targets, any of those things. And also, what are your non-negotiables in terms of salary, location, those sorts of things, and just knowing to stick to them. And only you know the answers to all of those questions, but it really will help you evaluate when you get the opportunity to have a role, sort of what are the best ones for you. I would also keep in mind that this is the first or one of many careers that you would have. So just you'll keep learning about your fit and the fields that interest you as you go along. And if you're really deep in the job search and losing hope, just keep in mind that it really only takes one person to say yes to you for you to have that opportunity. I had someone say that to me in the midst of my job search, and it was really, really helpful. In terms of resources, there's this article on quant that I found really, really helpful. It's called What Data Can't Do from the New Yorker. It kind of grapples with the limits of what we can even measure with numbers and how intentional we have to be. And there's lots of great books linked in that have really helped me in my work. And for general thoughts of what's up and coming in the field, I would recommend ThoughtSpot's 7 Trends in Analytics to watch out for in 2022. It's a great primer on the field today and really showcases trends like the increase in people analytics or data analytics and HR type of jobs, where organizations want to evaluate staff satisfaction and retain workers during this really competitive labor market. So just really interesting trends and how like these broader market things that we hear about in the news impact this industry. And lastly, I just want to share that I am available on LinkedIn if anyone's interested in learning more about the field, and I would love to connect.
Cool. Well, thank you so much again, Michelle. Um, this concludes this episode within the series Exploring Careers in Data Analytics. In closing, I want to encourage viewers to tune in to get more career perspectives and advice from a number of professionals in a broad variety of organizations in our other episodes in this series. I also want to encourage you to tune into our other MIDDVantage series, which can be accessed through the Events and Programs tab on the CCI website. Thank you again for watching.